Mastering the literature while refining your focus. You've heard me say already, my mantra, one of my all-time supervisory mantras is, God is in the structure, not in the detail. Structure, structure, structure. What's this thing going to look like? And in order to answer the question of what's my dissertation going to look like, you have to have a focus. And the focus means a hypothesis, or a contention if you like. It's something with an investigative character. And then the reading runs between the two of them. It helps you to think in a more focused way about what your hypothesis is. And of course, it helps you understand what kind of structure you need in order to substantiate the hypothesis. It's a tricky business. It's a bit of a juggling act. But in addition to structure, I think it also helps, something else I've mentioned but I need to emphasize now, it also helps to think about narrative. An argument's a story. And especially in that top triangle, where you're creating the rationale, where you're actually setting out the problem, where you deliver the reader to the point where you say, there is a case to be answered here, there's something to be investigated. Well then, out of this vast panoply of literature, you've got to shape it, you've got to bring the reader to the point where the reader says, okay, there's something the literature is not telling us, there's something we don't know, and I'll give you the nod, go ahead and investigate. And in order to do that well, it helps to think of it as a story, because structuring it is fairly easy. Whatever your literature is, you're going to start with a broad setup. You're going to start with the contextualizing literature, and then a slightly more focused, and then coming down to the point. Structuring that top triangle is not that difficult, but telling the story in a way that includes all the mainstays of the literature and actually brings you down to a point, actually begins slowly but subtly narrowing the focus is a bit of an art, frankly. And I told you yesterday, one of the tricks of doing that, of course, is to deploy footnotes and endnotes, whichever you use, quite well. All right, for those of you who've just come in, allow me to say we're going to get this done by about 10 o'clock, and then we're going to go straight up for the interactive session. And tomorrow I'm going to compress the afternoon section and the morning section together because they're linked. And it's an easy thing to do, and then we'll go up. You'll be exhausted by the end of it. You'll have to have an afternoon nap. Don't nod yes. You're supposed to say, no, I'm a PhD student. I'm full and robust and resilient. Dear, oh dear. Okay, so structure, yes, but the structure facilitates a story. And in all the best dissertations I've read and or supervised, the students are actually pretty good storytellers. You may think you don't have a talent for it, but the structure will help you to do that. And as always with those triangular shapes, if you're unclear, if you're trying to think your way through about how you would like to unfold this story about what the literature tells us, sometimes it helps to start at the bottom. Where do I want this to finish? Very often it's clear where you need to start. The grand mainstays of the literature. This is the literature about globalization and supply chains. Well, this is the literature about globalization's infrastructure. Fine. And then the next paragraph, supply chains. And then the next paragraph, or next section, it'll be road transport, a particular kind of, or it'll be refrigerated transport or something like that. So it keeps coming down from the strategic down to the something like tactical level. But it's not just dumping bits of literature in there. This is what A says about globalization and infrastructure. This is what B says. This is what C says. It's not an encyclopedia. It's not a dictionary. It's not a catalog. It's a story. And you're trying by deploying all this literature to persuade the reader to look at it in a certain way. And it doesn't start out. It doesn't feel so directional at the beginning. But as the thing narrows, well, you're like the reader's like cattle being driven through fences, and pretty soon, oops, no turning back. So it's a bit like that. Okay. So you're shaping an argument. Oops, forward, thank you. Right. And again, I know I've said this, but I have to keep repeating it because it's not an admonition, it's a piece of reassurance. The muse will not settle on your brow and give you a hypothesis in a moment of inspiration. You get it brick by brick. You have to sweat over it. You read, and you think, now I know what I want to do, and I can express it as a hypothesis. And then the next day you wake up and think, no, that doesn't work. Or it works, but it's not what I really want to do. So you go up and down and up and down. This is normal. You know, don't expect to get it on the first go. Don't expect to get it in the first month. You know, it's doctoral level, and it's the keystone, the foundation of all your work. So it's all the time you spend crafting a hypothesis and a structure is definitely worth it. All right. So prepare for the agonies. But it's creative. It's creative. In between all these exasperations and frustrations, you do realize as you enter the work more fully, as you're doing more and more reading, that you're actually beginning to get a grasp not only of the field, but of what it is that you can contribute to this field. There are satisfactions to be had along the way, and growing confidence as well. And it's never a steady upward curve. It tends to loop like that. That's normal. Be strong, be brave, have confidence. All right. And again, your reading can sometimes totally displace you. I've had many instances of students saying, oh, I've just read such and such a book, my hypothesis doesn't work, this book is right. My focus is all wrong. The usual sorts of, have I been reading the right literature? I've been reading the wrong literature. Read. In the first instance, there is no incorrect literature to read. One of the things that you'll discover as you're reading is which parts of the sub-literature aren't pertinent to you. It helps to know that it's out there. And by the way, if you're only reading just enough to create a structure, you're not reading enough. You know, don't be too narrow in your focus. This links back to the point I made earlier about being able to skim. If you get half a dozen books out of the library on your subject, let's call it supply chain logistics, it's pretty certain 2 of them are going to be a lot of use to you. But have a look at them anyway. See what's there. Get a grasp of the field. You don't have to read everything from cover to cover. You know, you're all good readers. It's why you're doctoral candidates. So get at least a sense of the field, and in your engaged reading, you have to read beyond what you think you strictly need, because you can't know without reading. So read widely. Don't worry that you're going in the wrong direction, and talk to your supervisor. One of the things your supervisor is really good for is directing you to the things you really ought to read or really must read, the fundamentals. And then use the bibliographies in the articles that are very good or the books that are very helpful, and span out from there. All of my best research happens through bibliographies. Oh, and if you've got a subsection, suppose you're doing something about the regulation of the internet, or the regulation of social media, and you suddenly discover, I actually have to find out something about international law. Don't be scared. Go and find out. And one of the ways of finding out what's been written about those sub-literatures you don't know anything about is, of course, introductory textbooks. I mean, textbooks are wonderful. if say you come up against international law and you think, oh, how am I going to do it? A textbook will help you to grasp the fundamentals quickly. That's what they're designed for. And another useful resource, believe it or not, is Amazon. Several years ago, I began reading some conference papers and official US government papers that were promoting nanotechnology, the science of nanotechnology. And I thought, the social science implications of this are vast. I wonder whether any social scientists have written about nanotechnology. And you know what I did? I went on to Amazon. And I had to swim through the first 20 pages are, molecular engineering and all that. And sure enough, I mean, there weren't many, but there were a few. And I thought, ooh, there's a wide opening here. There's not a gap. There's something I can drive a truck through. There's a lot to say about this. But it gave me a lot of confidence that there was room for me in there. And you can do the same. Don't be embarrassed about using Amazon for basic research like that. But your real gold mine is bibliographies. Okay. I've said don't throw your drafts away. Please don't throw your drafts away. And try to be prolific. If I tell you, okay, you've got an idea here, but it's a bit management consultancy, or it's a bit you're being an advocate here, and I need something of an investigative character. Write 3. Sometimes it's an all-night struggle to write 1. If you can write 3, write 3. And even if you know that one of them is rubbish, still leave it on the sheet and show it to your supervisor. It's sometimes the case that with 2 or 3 you can combine a couple and come up with something that's stronger than any of them individually. Don't be embarrassed. Really don't. Would I be pleased to show you any of my draft writing? No. I'd be embarrassed to show you my drafts, but you can't afford to be embarrassed. So overcome your fear, right? Okay. Don't hunt and peck. Nothing drives me to despair more quickly than to read an undergraduate essay where the student has used the electronic access available to everyone now and gone into the literature and like a chicken hunting and pecking. They find really nice quotes and they cut it and they paste it and they produce then what I call a Frankenstein essay. That is, it's just crudely stitched together from bits. And of course, unlike Frankenstein, it doesn't get the bolt of electricity, so it arrives as a sort of a lump on my desk. You can't do hunt and peck. You put yourselves in to be doctors of the philosophy of business or commerce or social sciences or whatever you like. That's serious. It really is serious. So you're going to get underneath the literature. Your engagement has to be deep enough that you understand something about the literature as a literature. You begin to understand the biases, the perspectives, and most importantly, what's utterly fascinating in any literature is what's not being considered. And also what's taken to be accepted wisdom. What everyone who researches leadership always starts with a certain contention. Many of the big intellectual breakthroughs across the full span of scholarship comes from heresy, comes from someone who says, you know what, I'm going to go back and look at the fundamental assumptions. As you're reading, that's what you're doing, if you're reading critically and seriously. But is it the case that must we always take a realist perspective? Must we always begin at this point? Has the accepted wisdom ever been tested with respect to A, B, and C? The primary text was written in 1985. Duh, the world's changed a lot since then. I wonder if it still holds up. And some of those approaches, if you like, some of those kinds of questions are what's behind making this degree a doctor of the philosophy of degree. And so this hunt and peck business, it just won't do. It really won't do. I mean, that's a variation on if you're not reading seriously, if you're not reading widely, you ain't reading enough. And it's true. And although it may sound contradictory, skimming matters. If the literature is very, very large indeed, and sometimes it is, you have to be able to survey it, as it were, fly over it, and get a sense of what the territory is like, what the land is like. And you should be skimming your PhD dissertations too. You've all got half a dozen PhD dissertations on your desk now, right? Of course you have. You can get them electronically too. Have you been to the library and asked whether you can access PhD dissertations online? No, no one has. I would have. I would have. It'll save you walking backwards and forwards, and they do weigh a lot. But you can get a lot that way, and it's easy to move through them very, very quickly. Like I said, table of contents, look for the hypothesis, check the intellectual weight. If it's related to your stuff, look at the bibliography, look at the way they're structured. The table of contents tells you a lot. When I examine a PhD dissertation as an external examiner, the first thing I look at is the table of contents. The very first thing. It gives me a sense of whether it's likely to be coherent or not. It doesn't give you a definitive answer, but it's a really good indicator. And the simpler the structure is, the easier I breathe. Okay. Again, I know there's some repetition here, but as you get books, as you get articles, record them. Start your bibliography. Do not wait until year 3 to start. Everything that you consult, put it down, because some of the really valuable things you find you won't remember, you won't locate again, and it just saves you time later on. So you photocopy 3 articles, or you get 3 from the library, enter the details right away. It'd be quite impressive after a bit. And I can't really tell you how to organize your notes. Everybody's got a different way. Everyone. I had a doctoral student who assured me that she never put a single thing on paper. Never wrote anything on paper at all. That's beyond me. I couldn't cope. Yes, I know I'm a dinosaur, but she's from outer space. That was just amazing to me. But you'll have your own system, but make sure that it is a system. Make sure that as you're writing and thinking, you'll be able to go back and make sense of it. Don't have it scattered all over. Go out and spend the money and buy yourself a really good notebook. Perhaps one where you can rip out pages, but that would be bad. Don't throw stuff away. I've said here, if you have to ask the question, how much reading is enough, an abstract question that I can't answer, the answer is you probably haven't done enough. I know it sounds a bit sort of blandly reassuring or even quasi-mystical, but you'll know. You will know. It doesn't actually take that long to have a grand, if you like, airplane level strategic survey of the literature, because very, very quickly you discover sub-literatures. You know, you get a very quick sense of how much of that territory is actually going to be relevant to you. And so then you land, as it were, and then push out to the margins of that literature. You will know. If you have to ask, the question is, you haven't read enough yet. That's a little blithe, but it's true. And if in doubt, ask your supervisor. Yeah. Frequently asked questions are next. This is fun. Should I have a chapter entitled Literature Review? If you like. My own feeling is that most dissertations and the creation of rationales, the first 3-4 chapters in that top triangle, entail literature across that entire span. If on average a chapter in a PhD, a classically formulated PhD, say 8 chapters, it'll be about 8 to 10,000 words a chapter. The idea of getting a literature survey compressed into a single chapter is asking a bit much. Now, it also depends on the subject. If you're doing some aspect of business and commerce where there isn't a vast literature, it may be possible to compress that, and you may be doing something on in that top triangle. It might be something like industry reports as well, although that's a kind of literature, or it might be performance and performance review and data. So you might find that it's split. So a classical literature review, articles and books, will only comprise part of what it is that's creating a rationale. A whole chapter might be full of data, for example, or official documentation. In a dissertation looking at the decentralization of the health system in Malawi, for example, there's going to be a whole chapter on the government documentation, which authorized it and specified it and all the rest of it. There'll be another chapter, probably preceding it, which is about the move to decentralization of government services or health systems, perhaps around the world, perhaps within Southern Africa. Then the specifics, and then down. So the literature survey isn't necessarily just all books and articles. It is possible, and I've seen it done successfully, literature review. My own bias, and it is a bias, is toward embedding the literature review in that story you tell to bring the reader down to that point. In most of the dissertations that I've dealt with, that's been the best way. It's also the most powerful way of demonstrating that you really have mastered the literature. But again, it depends on the nature of your subject and also how you structure it. But that's my take. A common, well, not uncommon question is a moment of panic when the student says, "There's no literature on my subject, what can I do?" Well, that's rarely the case, for a start. It can be, though, highly constrained. If you're doing something quite specialist, what you should do in the first instance is A, check with your supervisor if you're right, and climb up and down your supervisor's shelves. You might find that you were just wrong. But if it's a very narrow literature, then one exercise you could do is pull back from your narrow focus and ask whether it's too narrow. Is it going to pass the so what test? Is it too particular? You can bet if you're going to be looking at, say, sexual and reproductive health clinics in 2 villages in rural Tanzania, there's probably not going to be a literature on that, but there is a literature on sexual and reproductive health, a vast literature, literature's plural, and vast literatures too well, vast, but considerable literatures on the Tanzanian health system. So one way of handling this too is to think about what kind of context is involved. The literature doesn't have to support the particular hypothesis or the particular narrow focus that you've got in mind. The literature, and thinking about that 2 triangle shape, is creating a context. It's showing why it is that you're going to look at your particular focus. But the answer to the question, "There's no literature in my subject," is almost always, "You're wrong." And the complementary question, the sister to that question is, "I've just found a book that's been published, somebody's written my dissertation, what am I going to do?" Well, what you're going to do is not panic. As I've said to a couple of you privately, people are still writing dissertations about Shakespeare, and good ones too. There's always something new to say. People will be writing about decentralizing health systems, but your particular take, your data, your focus, your perspective, your analysis will be your own. You can't help but be individual, and you will be sufficiently creative. How do I know that? Because you can't write one without a hypothesis, and you can't have a hypothesis without an act of creation. So you need to have confidence in your ability to find your place in the scholarly world. You make a contribution to knowledge, but it's incremental, and you're making a contribution to knowledge within a crowded field, but there's always room for you, always. Okay. No one has written about what I'm proposing. Is this too risky? Again, wrong. Wrong. Perhaps no one has looked at your specific cases. Perhaps no one has actually pulled out and synthesized the themes for analyzing in the way that you'll do. I have never yet, I've heard of it, but I've never yet had a student who came up with something that was so unusual I thought, you've no chance of doing this. You are, of course, you all come from academic backgrounds. You all tend to gravitate toward things you already know something about by dint of your reading or by dint of your professional working lives. You know, so it's not a common question, and I would be astonished if I heard it. I had a colleague who did, and he advised her not to try. I wish I could remember what it was. It was something utterly bizarre. I haven't encountered any of you yet who've got an idea that's either bizarre or so exotic that you're going to run into that problem. Now here's an interesting one, the penultimate one. The experts can't agree, or there are 2 or 3 schools of thought on my subject. Good. Get in there and fight your corner, is my answer. That's scholarly life for you. A lot of scholarship, there are basically 2 kinds. Some scholarship proceeds by increments. Sometimes, say, trying to make sense of the world we're busy making. So there's a lot of scholarship about globalization and its impacts on communities, on business. And we're racing to catch up with social media and what it means and how it affects commerce and how it affects adolescent mental health and everything else. We're racing. So there is a field of scholarship where the advances are incremental. There are other forms of scholarship which are essentially argumentative. I mean, in the sciences, for example, a lot of the scholarship on evolution is argument. You know, this is the mechanism, that's the mechanism, this is how evolution works. No, this is the way it works. Or in the social sciences, in business, politics is often very like that. And it's very difficult sometimes for a PhD student to enter this field because the arguments can get very quasi-theological. In other words, they've been going on for so many years, it takes weeks to actually find out what it is they're talking about, why it is they get so exercised about it. But I think for most of you, on having heard at least in outline what you've got in mind, you're likely to be entering a field that's the former. In other words, not a hugely contentious A versus B field, but a field in which we're trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to add to our understanding of the world. And this last question, I have a really interesting, pertinent example. I think the consensus in the literature is wrong. And how can I go about challenging this? Several years ago, I had a man, lovely man, who was working in Uganda at the time that the first prosecution by the International Criminal Court was brought against the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA. And this was a big deal in international politics. This was the International Criminal Court, in which a lot of hope had been invested. And so all the eyes of the world were on this first prosecution. And everybody very much wanted it to work. He was on the ground. And he's utterly convinced. He was red hot when he came to me. He was angry, in fact. He said, I've read the literature and it says it was a success. It said the ICC, the criminal court, brought the LRA to the negotiating table. And he said, it's not true. He said, they destroyed local peacemaking efforts. And he said, I'm so angry about this. Well, several weeks later, after I'd calmed him down, we began to work on this. And one of his early fears was, how can I contend against all the leaders of the field? And I said, you contend by telling the truth, by investigating and by bringing your arguments to bear, by making a really powerful case. And that's exactly what he did. I have to say it took some real intellectual courage I was utterly delighted with what he produced. And what he did was a very, very meticulous piece of work. He took all the mainstays of the literature and he followed them right back. He went through every footnote and he traced everything right back, and he found that it just disappeared. It was all smoke and mirrors. There was no substantial evidence to support the conventional wisdom that the intervention was a success. I put it to you as a highly unusual case, and he was unusually placed because he'd been on the ground and he'd actually been working with local peacemaking groups trying to get children away from the LRA. But here's the way it worked. Here's the way it mapped out onto the two triangles. It took a long time for us to do this. And I'm not just even talking about the analysis that he had to do, say from chapters, oops, I beg your pardon. It took him here we are. It took him a long time to come up with that shape. Not only a long time to do the analysis in chapters 5, 6, and 7, but also just to get the fundamental shape. And again, one of the things he discovered when he came in, he'd never read anything about justice. He'd never read anything about international law, and he didn't even know anything about the International Criminal Court in a formal sense. I mean, he knew about it operationally. He knew what happened on the ground. Wow, man, did he have a lot of literature to get through. Really a lot. But he did. And look at the way it's shaped. You know, because he starts with, this is justice in theory and practice. So he was doing something highly theoretical. These are ideas about justice. We've got the theory of justice and the practice of justice. So it's a highly condensed take on a literature that he had to enter. And then interventionism, international criminal law, and the creation of the ICC. So you can see the shape coming down, and then the pursuit of international criminal justice in volatile environments. And that chapter 4 is a kind of a pivot chapter. I can't, to be perfectly honest, I've got a dissertation at home somewhere, but I can't remember where his hypothesis came in, but you can see where the pivot point is. He could well have started with the hypothesis right at the beginning. This would have been one of those cases where he said the origin of this dissertation was that in those years I was working in this place and I became convinced that, etc., etc., etc. It's perfectly legitimate to do that. So this is my hypothesis, this is my methodology, etc., etc. Note here that he didn't do any field work. He didn't go back to Uganda. He didn't interview anyone. This was a desk job. And a very powerful one it was too. So one of the reasons I'm showing you this is not only to give you another example about how an idea maps onto that framework, but also because, you know, within the 3 years, and he did it within the standard time, he had to summon up his courage and summon up his stamina as well, and move through 3 literatures he wasn't familiar with. This man had done an undergraduate degree at Oxford and not done a degree since. And I took him on as a PhD student, a mature professional. So, I think he trained as a botanist. He was a scientist. So this is a big leap for him, but he could do it, and he could do it because he was consistent, he was dedicated, and he was disciplined. Yeah, why is this man laughing? But it's true. He knew that he had a passion for the subject. He started out being angry, and then he finished being determined. And because he had a passion for what he was doing, nothing got in his way. And I was able to help him with the justice literature and the intervention literature, which I know quite well. But he also thought quite creatively within those chapters. Indeed, he stood up to me. His take on theory, the theory of justice, I thought he was wrong, and I didn't think it would work. He was right. I surrendered. And that goes back to the thing I was saying about supervision. Sometimes you've got to You've got to push back gently. Okay. A really, really fascinating case. Okay. Yeah. There we are. I don't know whether the hypothesis methodology was there, but a reason for showing you this is sometimes that top triangle is 4 chapters. Doesn't matter. Very, very often you've got two context-setting pieces. You know, and so it'll bring you down to 4 chapters. That's okay. Okay. Survey the arena. Identify the classics, the foundational literature. You don't have to be linear about this. You know, in order to maintain your fascination with what you're doing, read the current stuff as well. If one of the classics was written 20 years ago, have it on your desk and get through it. But you don't have to start, you know, at the very beginning and go in a linear fashion. I know not everybody can read 5 books at once. Does anybody read more than 1 book at once here? Yeah, of course. Yeah, because we have to. I'm currently reading 5 books. The last person I said that to said, no wonder you are like you are. I think it was an insult, I'm not certain. But the more you eat, the bigger your appetite. You will find that you're able to cope because the literatures are slightly different. You know, you might find you're doing something theoretical and you're doing something very, very focused, or you're making your way through an edited book to see if it's useful, and you're keeping your bibliography up to date, and you're doing the heavy duty reading. There are lots and lots of tasks you can do. Okay, which are the key journals and how can I access them? Who's done that yet? Who's done that? You go to the library or you sit at your desk and access UKZN Library, and if you're looking at supply chains, find out if there's a journal that does supply chain management. I bet there is. All the keywords, any keyword that attaches to your subject, you should do a keyword search in the library or talk to the subject librarian and say, can you give me the name of every journal that has this in it? I've done this exercise. When I started researching nanotechnology, I thought, okay, I'll go and get nanotechnology, nanoscience, and I did a keyword search. 32 journals. Okay, so most of them I could filter out, because I can't even read bioengineering and nanotech, and I can't understand molecular chemistry and biotechnology, or nanotechnology. It's fine. But it was a really interesting exercise. Right at the beginning of my career, as a fresh postdoc, I fell in love with international law. I thought, oh good, I'll find out what's out there. I lost count of the number of international law journals. In fact, there were so many I couldn't even keep up with what they were producing, never mind read them all. And I realized that my fascination would need to get a focus very quickly. Find out what's out there. You know, make it easy for yourselves. This is real basic ambition. If you're gonna go out hunting, you don't just go hunting anywhere. You go hunting where you know there's game. Right? You're not going to be able to read everything you find, but you better find everything in order to be able to make judgments about it. So do exercise your imagination in what I call the fundamentals. And I've been through it all with you. Read the university admin covering your degree. Get some PhD dissertations. Find out what journals are out there. Find out what the mainstays of the literature are, and talk to a librarian. Because if you're doing anything to do with data or company reports or what's generally called the grey literature, the non-academic literature, they're fonts of knowledge. And talk to your supervisor. Okay, so where are the relevant archives and databases? What portion of official and governmental documentation will I be able to access? These days, most of it. Most of it. Oh, what a gift. You've no idea. I'm going to give you 30 seconds of old fartdom. When UN Security Council resolutions used to be issued, you would write to an administrator in the United Nations in New York and hope they would take pity on you and send you a copy. Well, now they're online before they're even in the newspaper. It's a golden age for doing research, and avail yourselves. You know, even as I'm saying, be creative, do your structure, think about your hypothesis. Yeah, it's something else you need to do. Find out what's out there, for heaven's sake. And it's over and over. Bibliographies. I love reading a book that's got a rich bibliography. Sit there with a pencil and have get. All right, I'm not going to do that. All right, so that's what I have to say about this. Don't forget, yes, structure, but you're telling a story. And as you get a tentative, say 8 to 10 chapter structure, and you look at that top triangle and think, where does this need to end? It helps you to craft a story. Most of us can do beginnings, you know, once upon a time and all that. But it is rather like that. But crafting an ending can be actually quite difficult. So you're telling a story, and it's an art, and it's a lovely piece of creativity because it's not as exasperating as coming up with your hypothesis. I do hope you enjoy that part of it. Okay, questions. What do we got? Comments? What in heaven's name are you talking about? Go on, you're just scratching your nose, aren't you? You're sitting in a dangerous place to be scratching your nose, really. Nothing? We're okay? Yes, sir.
Reasons should our literature review, you know, what the stuff we look at? How recent should they be?
How?
Recent. Like, I mean, if
Yeah.
we want to look at literature from the 80s that we feel that impacts in our research, but then our supervisor feels it's too outdated. You know, I'm just, is there like a guideline on, or how can we justify using that kind of older material?
Your judgment justifies it. I don't mean to be blithe. I'll try to give you a good answer. If I got a draft chapter on something fairly current, let's say it was on sexual and reproductive health rights, very, very current, very hot, very controversial, very important, and the chapter didn't have a reference that went past, say, 1990, I'd say this isn't up to date. I would know right away that you weren't reading enough literature. Something would be wrong. But if you get a judgment, let's suppose you got an article from 1985, which, sticking to the topic, sexual and reproductive health, was explaining why it is that it's so important, how it links to population, how it links to I don't know, A, B, C, D, sorry, my brain's just frozen, how it links to, and it's a really succinct way of saying it. It doesn't matter that it's in 1985, it's a really balanced judgment that held then and holds now. And of course you would judge it the same way. Trust your judgment is my answer. But if there's a modern literature, you've got to find a place to insert that as well, or to indicate that. And if there's a modern literature and you're only doing the old stuff, you're not looking.
If there isn't, and this is the only thing that you have, but you asked to go and look for something more recent, and but this is the one substance that you feel.
Yeah, fine. I'd be surprised if you were working on a topic that had nothing at all. And if you do feel you've hit a wall, or your particular focus is a problem, then you need to pull the lens back a little bit and do more broad contextualizing stuff. In that position, you don't mind me saying what your topic is? Okay, so this lady's looking at the training of South African doctors in Cuba, and how it is when they come back. Their training, although medically and scientifically it's fine, it's not geared toward the particular health needs of the population of South Africa. Now, what within that she wants to do is another matter. But suppose there's unlikely to be a vast literature on that. But if you pull back a little bit, you're likely to find, aren't you, that there's things about training. Well, there's the literature on training, the literature on medical training. There'll be a very considerable one on that. And there'll probably also be something about universities and training. What else have we got? I would actually just, well, I'd pull back and think, because you would provide contextualizing literature. So, you know, if there's nobody has written anything at all in the academic literature about South African doctors being trained in Cuba, you need to take an apparent weakness and turn it into a strength. So your literature survey, that top triangle, is essentially, you would talk about, let's suppose you'd start with training, the medical profession in training, just a large thing. This is what it is, and it's not just about biology and physiology, it's also about interaction with populations and understanding the health needs, blah, 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 blah. All right, and that's just in general, and that applies everywhere. And then you would say, you might say something about, oh no, suppose the first chapter is looking at the medical profession in training, just writ large. It's not a problem. This is what it is, and this is how it's evolved, and it has evolved quite a lot. Doctors are expected to know much more than just about bodies as sites of infection. And you can talk about this. You can say, you know, they're now taught psychology. They're now taught about mental illnesses. You know, women are no longer supposed to be suffering from hysteria. You know, all that sort of stuff. So there is that evolution. So start with medical training, the evolution of medical training. Then you could start with, then you could go with cultural appropriateness. So it'd be a specific instance of what it is that doctors need in order to perform well. And then the South African health system and its inadequate infrastructure for training doctors, why there's bottlenecks and why they've got to go to Cuba. And that could deliver you then to a hypothesis. I'm thinking crudely, but that would be one way of getting around that there is no literature dedicated to that particular focus you've got. So you pull back and you provide a context. Now, the trick for you, the art on that crude formulation, would be telling the story. Telling the story to make it really quite compelling, why it is we should be looking at this. And you can, because the top chapter says, look, medical training is never going to be one thing forever and a day. You know, we keep learning about human needs and what health comprises and what illness is, right? And South Africa in particular has got this difficulty, and Cuba's got its own peculiarities. And you tell a story where I'm beginning to say, oh yeah, right, So the solution to the problem that the South African government or the South African Medical Council faces generates its own problems, right? Which you're going to analyze. So you can still provide a rationale even if there's no literature on the particular thing you're interested in. It makes making a contribution to knowledge a little easier for you. So there is a benefit. Okay. Anything else on literature? Be ambitious, yes.
How do you not be overwhelmed by the literature when you're trying to find your focus? I think maybe also, in other words, how do you manage not wasting time when you're sifting through the literature to try and find
there isn't an answer. There are only techniques, and everyone's got a different technique. Some people will walk into a library and freak out. I've seen that happen. The young brother of a colleague of mine came to visit me in Cambridge once, or came to visit her, and he said, would you mind walking my brother around? He's thinking about applying. I said, sure. I said, what are you interested in studying? And he said, law. I said, great, come on, we'll go to the law library. And he freaked out. I mean, there were just thousands and thousands of books in this ancient building. It happens. I'm a library rat, so it's never happened to me. I just think, yeah, lock me up, you know, I'm never going home. But most of you fall somewhere in between. And there are only techniques. And one technique, of course, is just to blank it out and to concentrate on what's in front of you. Or simply prioritize what you've got to do. You know, so you might, for example, say, I'm going to read this book that I know I've got to get into. I'm only going to concentrate on that for 3 days. Or I'm going to concentrate on crafting a hypothesis that's unencumbered by literature. I'm going to guess and see if that suggests what I need. You know, you might do as I suggested, going out and instead of becoming overwhelmed, just gathering information to find out what's out there. There's no answer to that. And I think most of us at some time do feel overwhelmed. We do feel there's too much. We don't know how to condense things. We sometimes too much information, too many books, too much literature is as difficult a problem as too little. It happens. And I can even get overwhelmed. My own structures can overwhelm me. I was working on a subject. I'll tell you what it is. I was working on global governance, and I thought, how am I going to deal with all this disparate global governance literature? They all seem to be talking about related things, but in different ways. So I thought, I know. I'll just write out some propositions. And I thought, oh, that's great. Global governance is, needs to be, should be, And I had 8 of these. And I thought, great, it'll make a wonderful article. And I began writing the article, and I thought, I can't do this. There's just too much. I can't put this in 8,000 to 10,000 words. And so I had my overwhelmed moment. And when I woke up the next day, I thought, it's a book, dummy. Each of those propositions was a chapter. It worked. It's fine. There are usually ways around it. But except there are moments when you can, in various ways, be overwhelmed. But just block some stuff out. The way to avoid, it's like a kind of agoraphobia. If you're agoraphobic, go indoors. You know, if you're panicked by the sheer number of stuff, read something. Just read something instead, and it'll calm your mind a little. Right? Yes, sir.
My topic is digital transformation and its influence on strategic leadership.
What kind of transformation?
Digital transformation
okay.
and its influence on strategic leadership.
Okay, digital transformation and its effect on strategic leadership. Okay.
Yes. Now, as I was going through literature, I realized that I identified a number of gaps. But one of the gaps that I think kind of fascinated me a little bit is that most of the scholars have written in specific fields, but it's not, I mean, they have not discussed or researched digital transformation broadly. So like, for example, digital transformation in marketing, automotive, banking,
Sure.
retail.
Yeah.
So now I was just looking at a doctorate research student. How would is it not going to be too broad if I use this gap whereby I have to somehow maybe not only look at one field of study like marketing, retailing, or government, because there's also digital transformation happening in the government.
I think what you've got isn't so much a gap as a landscape. I mean, your front door isn't a gap. It's you know, where the mouse gets in the wall, that's a gap. I think what you've got to do, you've got at least 2 literatures there. There's all those, at least a single literature on leadership, and there's also another huge literature on digitization and business, if you like. Those are huge. Now, if most of the literature is industry specific, you know, automotives and, you know, the chemical industry and all the rest of it, that's not a gap. The gap is what you're looking for. What counts as a gap is what we don't know. And the clue might be in that word transformation. See, you don't know about transformation. It's dinosaurs like me who know about transformation, because I can remember businesses that never had computers. Nothing was computerized. No government records were computerized. That was a moment of transformation. You'd struggle to find a business of any size these days that wasn't completely digitized in various ways. So I think there might be a clue for you in that word transformation. I don't think, I'm guessing, and I'm certainly not, I'm giving you a shove, but I'm not pushing you in a direction. I think you need to break down this idea of transformation. Businesses have all kinds of problems to do with their computing network. I read a book, for pleasure, believe it or not, about cost overruns in public projects. And a lot of it has to do with the relationship between computer consultants and managers. And sometimes it's because the managers don't know what they want, or because the computer consultants have got their own ideas about what will work, and you get these all manner of mismatches, and hence cost overruns, vast cost overruns. Now that was a really interesting topic. You're still very, very early in the game. It's too large. Take the idea of transformation and ask yourself what you mean by that. The other thing you should think about, and I know this is making it larger rather than smaller, but sometimes you've got to expand in order to contract in an orderly way. The other thing to do is to think, if there is this wonderful literature about the impacts of digital technologies on various industries, you could do separate cases of something. What they're cases of, you and I don't know yet. But you could do, or you could do it thematically. So if you were looking at a particular industry, the three themes could be something like mismatched software protocols, computer illiterate managers who don't really know how to translate the strategic ideas into, and perhaps consultants who don't understand the needs of business, IT specialists. So three forms of mismatch, if you like. And it'd be easy then to see what a hypothesis might look like there. If you did it thematically, mismatched, IT doesn't know enough about business, business doesn't know enough about IT, and the software protocols are often mismatched to the needs, something like that. If you had three themes, then you could say, for example, in the auto industry, for example, in the chemical industry, for example, at UKZN, and you could make them really quite richly illustrated to help make your point. But the structure would be essentially very simple. The reason it often fails, I've identified three reasons, because I pulled them out of the literature. So, but unpack transformation. I think that's what I would do.
Thank you.
Okay. Listen.
I just wanted to offer one comment to then without being overwhelmed, and then ask you a slightly different question. So I think it all relates to your experience, and it's incredibly anxiety-provoking when you get to the point that you're just so overwhelmed you can't find any direction. And I found in my journey that I started with journals, and through a haphazard process came to the realization of how important it was to first look at what they were citing before I really read in detail what they were saying. And from that, I found 2 or 3 books that were not really in my field of law, they were more in a sort of socio-legal, socio-political kind of text. But within them, and I didn't read the book in detail cover to cover, but one reads it and digests certain parts in more detail, there was a pattern. And as soon as I found that sort of rubric or that way of thinking and being able to link it to the way cases are analyzed, because I have to focus on the literature that's specific to my field, which is legal cases, that I found suddenly made the process I think that first tip there of actually finding classic texts, ones that come up again and again, and within that text, the dominant idea or key way of thinking, which might either be the way you then analyze things, or you may challenge how it's been analyzed. Having something to hang on to as a thread through the reading, I've just found so helpful.
That's really helpful. Yeah, it's good. Thank you. Yeah, that's really.
I just wanted to ask if you had advice about studies which touch on other disciplines where you don't want to do interdisciplinary research. I, for example, want to do a PhD in law, but have stupidly picked a topic that intersects with information technology. And I'm the kind of person that forgets how to find something in Outlook. So it's a problem. I'm clearly not an IT specialist, and I can't read technical literature around app architecture and security protocols. I can understand it at a very general level. I can't refer to it or confidently include it in any way. Do you have any suggestions for how to handle that? Does one ignore that literature? Does one refer to it by way of glancing?
Well, in the hypothetical bridge. I mean, suppose on that classic structure you've got a where the two triangles meet. There's a little, usually quite a relatively short chapter. One of the things that it's always important to do is what I call a back covering exercise, which is to say, this is my rationale, this is what I'm doing, but this is what I've left out. I am aware of the links between A and B, but I've left them out because, or I chose a single case rather than a comparative study or rather than a thematic study because the argumentative purchase is better, because there are lots of reasons. You basically cover your back. So you don't need intellectually to apologize for what's not in a dissertation. You're not an IT specialist, but of course because you're doing law and regulation, you don't need to know about the mathematics behind the architecture. That's simple. Where do you find this stuff? Talk to the subject librarian and see if you can do keyword searches within journals. I mean, if you've got, there's a journal, Computing Law and Society. I think there is one, isn't there? Yeah, something like that. Most journals published by most mainline publishers, Elsevier and Palgrave and Oxford and all the rest of them, they actually have searches within the journal. So I would do a keyword search because you're going to be looking in social science and legal journals. I would also do the same thing in law journals. And having done that, I would then ask the subject librarian, where can I get the keyword? Because you're trying to avoid literature where you're not going to find anything of use. Well, that's easy. You can tell from the titles. Again, I might do a quick and dirty Amazon search as well. I don't know how good the search facility is, but I would type in something like law and social media, or regulation and social media, or regulation. I mean, there's going to be a lot of stuff now about Facebook and surveillance and all that, but you can sweep that aside. You could do all that in half an hour. Why is this woman laughing? Okay, 45 minutes. All right. Yeah, okay, but you can do it. But I would do keyword searches within like, but don't worry about what you don't know if it's not pertinent to you. I mean, if you do commercial law and you realize you've actually got to touch on international law, you know enough about legal literature to know how to find out what you need to know. For you, that's probably not difficult. And it's actually not difficult either to farm out. When I was doing nanotechnology, same sort of thing. I can't do the science. I don't know anything about physics. So in some ways, it was actually quite easy to farm it out. The only difficult bits were you'd sometimes have books that combined a little bit of the two, and those were books that I skimmed rather than read all the way. By the way, something that you mentioned a little bit earlier in your intervention, sooner or later you will get lucky and you will find a book or an article or an author who's key, whose style or whose way of structuring things, whose approach suits you really well. You'll actually have a kind of a favorite author who will act as something of a mentor. My approach to writing always used to be very narrative rather than very thematic, until I read a book chapter, as it happens, by a well-known UK academic, and as soon as I hit this thematic structure, I thought, what a clever way of doing it. And it's infected all of my scholarship, infected my approach to supervising doctorates. You may not have quite so dramatic a find, but even when I was doing my doctorate, I found, ooh, that's utter simplicity, or that's really very compelling, or that's very, very clever, that speaks to me. And you will find that if you're alert, and of course you are. Is that helpful? Is that? Make good use of the library. You know, when you hit a roadblock, don't hide, get creative, get adventurous, and help each other. You know, what shall I do? What did you do when you got blocked? Okay? Now, have you got the stamina? If you need a cup of tea, do you need that first, or do you want to go straight up, those of you who are coming for the interactive session? What a dumb question. What a dumb way to put it. All right. In 5 minutes, I'm going to be here and I'm going to lead everyone who wants to be in the interactive session upstairs in 5 minutes. That's enough time for a cup of wonderful tea. Okay? And there's a register. You filled in the register, right? I don't know why, but you've got to do this stuff. Fill in the register.